Joining us now, former New Zealand Prime Minister Helen Clark. Thank you so much for being on the program, and also you were Prime Minister at the time of the attacks 20 years ago. What can you remember about that day?
What I remember very clearly is that I was in the airport lounge in Hong Kong on my way to missions to Europe, and I could see on the TV monitor there these images of smoke coming out of towers in New York. There was no interpretation. It was very difficult to understand what was happening, and this was probably at the very early stage of what had happened. So I carried on, not having any advice to the contrary, on a plane to Rome, where I had meetings with the Italian Prime Minister and others planned for that day. And when I was in the plane, I got a call on the plane, even then, 20 years ago, this was possible, from Mark Prebble, my head of department, and he told me what they knew, which of course was still relatively sketchy. We agreed that I'd talk when I landed in Rome, and when we spoke again, I said it was clear that I should turn around and come home, which I did at the end of the day, because I feel the captain should be on the bridge when there are epochal events like this, shall we say.
What immediate decisions, apart from returning to New Zealand, did you have to make in the aftermath of 9/11?
Well, obviously returning to New Zealand, number one, I had acting Prime Minister in place, which was Jim Anderton, and when Parliament convened, which would have been that day, it happened in the early hours of the morning out times, when Parliament convened, he made a statement and other parties responded to that, and obviously all responded appropriately with shock and concern and thoughts for the families. I probably wasn't immediately that we would have been aware that there were 2 New Zealand citizens killed in the attack, but when that came through, that was obviously brought it even closer to home to New Zealand. But it was really a question then of how to react, sort of messaging. And then as the issues developed, we got involved with the affairs of Afghanistan, which most people had very little knowledge of, except from their overland tours in the 60s and 70s before it fell into chaos. And the last 20 years has seen us involved one way or another there.
Well, jumping ahead, I guess, if we're talking about Afghanistan, where do you feel we're at? Where do you feel we're at now, 20 years later on from 9/11, following the announcement of the war on terror from George W. Bush? Are we any further advanced?
No, we're probably worse off, really, because there's so many vicious terrorist groups, and we feel the backlash of it right here in New Zealand. Just in the last 8-10 days, the terrorists who tried to kill people in the Countdown supermarket in Linmore brings it home, and then one extreme reaction, you get another on the other end, and so on. So we had the xenophobic white nationalists who killed the many people at the Christchurch Mosque. So, no, I mean, we're in an immensely worse state with exposure to global terrorism than we were. And I think, as I said in the op-ed in the Sunday Star Times today, if you rewrite the history books and could take a fresh start, and that's never possible, but I think pronouncing the global war on terror was a mistake. It needed more reflection on what to do, and certainly once the Taliban were out of power in Afghanistan, that country needed long-term development support. This was a fragile, landlocked country which had experienced in recent decades tremendous civil war, drought, strife, and had, sort of let's say centuries-long history of warlordism and so on. So it was never going to be right in 1 year, 2 years, 3 or 20. Its people needed time, and great as the gains for quite a lot of people were, with more girls in school and the maternal mortality and child mortality rates coming down and so on. A lot of those gains didn't really reach the remote rural areas where the Taliban began to regroup and fight back.
Yeah. Let's have a word on Iraq then. And it was something, I believe, to your eternal credit, that you resisted pressure to get involved in the war in Iraq. Can you take us back to what that pressure was like and what it was like for New Zealand to say, we don't support this?
So in 2002, by then we had military observers sitting in the huge US military headquarters in Tampa, Florida. And that was because of the involvement in Afghanistan. And down the corridors, literally, the planning was going on for Iraq. So, we're not stupid. We knew that something was being planned. We always had reservations. And I wouldn't say we came under any pressure to go into Iraq because the position was made known fairly consistently. This was definitely a mistake. Look, Saddam Hussein was a hideous tyrant, but his own people need to take him out. When there's an external invasion to take out someone like him, and they made terrible mistakes in the aftermath of toppling him, like disbanding the Afghan army. Well, what is a trained army going to do when the salaries are removed? It's going to look for someone else who can pay. And eventually, quite a lot of the Iraqi army ended up with the Sunni extremists and even with the ISIS group that took over Mosul and parts of Iraq, which then led to, I think an Obama surge to go in and push them out again. So the invasion of Iraq totally destabilized Iraq, but also gives fresh momentum to these jihadist groups who want to, who they need an enemy, to really focus on. So that was a huge mistake, and we were absolutely right, and I think vindicated, as history shows, in not being part of that.
Was that the big mistake in terms of the America's response to the war on terror, or do you think that the mistakes, or with the wisdom of hindsight, of course, because you can understand the pressure on a president following an unbelievably successful attack, I guess we can use that perverse expression, but. Was that the big mistake, or were there decisions that were made in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 where you think, that was a mistake too?
Well, again, if we replay the record, the Taliban was a very, very closed regime. I think the only diplomatic posts sitting in Kabul at the time of 2001 were Pakistan, which has always, had a lot to do, shall we say, with the internal affairs of Afghanistan, and I think the United Arab Emirates. So they were very closed off. And I remember having the impression at the time that they probably weren't even particularly registering the seriousness of the American message, which is hand over bin Laden or we're coming after you. So they just weren't attuned to the wider world. They didn't go to the United Nations. They just were delinked, as it were. So anyway, they didn't get that message, and they were driven from power. But here's another step. In 2002, the international community sort of supported the Afghan factions coming together in a meeting in Bonn in Germany. It was called a Lawyer-Jirga. That's a local term for a convening. And at the time, a New York Times report tells us that the Taliban did make overtures to see whether they could be included. And the man who became the president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, wanted them included. But the Americans, of course, they were sort of full of triumphalism of having defeated the Taliban. They didn't want them near it. Now, again, what we know, and go back to the experience of the end of the war in 1918 and the sanctions on Germany and the weakening of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Hitler. What we know is if the vanquished aren't able to be dealt with in some way, you lay down, toxic legacy for the future. And so because the Taliban were never able to be part of a discussion, eventually they took their own route. Now, the next mistake from that was, as I say, that almost immediately in 2002, the planning began about an invasion of Iraq. So the eye went off the ball on Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And in that sort of vacuum, as the US got dragged into the quagmire of Iraq, Afghanistan didn't get enough attention. And again, the Taliban regrouped. So you could find all sorts of lessons of history in this.
Well, given the lessons that we can all observe, what do you think America would do if there was another attack on a similar scale today? Do you think America would react substantively differently, having learnt some lessons from the past?
No, I don't. I don't. You see, for many years after the fall of Saigon and the helicoptering of people out of there, at the end of the Vietnam War, they refrained from these sorts of incursions. And then there was also the ghastly business of the American servicemen being, corpses dragged through the streets in Mogadishu. So they were kind of not interested in this kind of involvement. But they got over it sufficiently to do Afghanistan, and then emboldened by that, they went on to Iraq. Now, I have to say, if you look at the footage of George W. Bush it's commenting on 9/11 and saying we're going to hunt these people down, and then you fast forward to the horrible suicide bombing at Kabul airport 2 or 3 weeks ago, and President Biden's appearance saying we're going to hunt you down, and then hunting them down. We now know that a sort of local aid worker and his family of 10 were killed in that airstrike after the Kabul airport attack. So I don't think there'd be any different reaction, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, which is distressing. We really appreciate you being on the program and taking us back to 20 years ago. That is former Prime Minister Helen Clark. Enjoy your afternoon.